The world feels unfinished. The swamps stretch endlessly beneath a sky that never seems to clear, their dark waters reflecting a dim, heavy light. The air is thick, not with movement, but with stillness, dense, quiet, almost pressing against everything that exists. Nothing rushes here, nothing claims control. It is a world that exists, but has not yet decided what it will become. In these shallow waters, life moves carefully. Small creatures drift and crawl, their bodies soft, uncertain, shaped more by possibility than by purpose. Each movement feels slow, almost cautious, as if the act of living itself is still being learned. There are no rulers, no dominant forms casting shadows across the land. Only quiet attempts, unfolding without direction, without urgency. The boundary between water and land is unclear. Mud blends into pools. Vegetation rises from saturated ground, and nothing holds a fixed shape for long. The surface shifts under the slightest pressure, refusing stability. Even the plants seem uncertain, thin structures reaching upward without resistance, as if searching for something they cannot yet find. Above it all, the air carries a hidden weight. It is rich, far richer than it will be in later ages, filled with something that quietly supports every form of life. Oxygen moves through this world without being seen, entering bodies, fueling growth, allowing processes to continue longer than they otherwise could. It does not demand attention, yet it changes everything. Nothing here appears extraordinary. There are no massive bodies moving through the water, no sudden bursts of dominance, no clear signs that anything remarkable is about to emerge. The world feels calm, almost uneventful, as if it exists in a state of waiting. And yet, beneath that calm, something is forming. Not in a way that can be seen directly, not in a moment that can be pointed to and named. The change is quieter than that. It exists in the smallest adjustments, in the gradual strengthening of limbs, in the subtle shift of bodies learning to hold themselves differently. Each generation carries a slight difference from the one before it, small enough to go unnoticed, but steady enough to continue. Movement stretches further, balance improves. The ability to remain outside the water, even briefly, begins to take shape. These are not dramatic transformations. They do not redefine the world overnight. But they carry a direction, a sense that something is slowly building toward a form that does not yet exist. There is a strange tension in this stillness, the kind that does not come from danger, but from expectation. The sense that the world is preparing for something, even if nothing within it fully understands what that might be. The conditions are already in place, quietly supporting possibilities that have not yet revealed themselves. It is easy to miss this moment, to look at this world and see only simplicity, only slow movement and uncertain life. But simplicity can hide complexity, and stillness can hide change. What appears quiet is often where the most important transformations begin. The air grows heavy with potential, the waters deepen with unseen activity, and the boundary between what exists and what could exist begins to soften. The world is no longer just a place where life survives. It is becoming a place where life expands. And somewhere within this quiet, among creatures that seem too small to matter, the first steps towards something larger have already begun. Not sudden, not obvious, but inevitable, because when a world removes its limits, life does not remain the same. It moves forward, slowly at first, then with increasing certainty, shaping itself into forms that match what is now possible. The silence remains, but it is no longer empty. It is filled with direction. And as that direction strengthens, as each small change builds upon the last, the question begins to take shape without ever being spoken. If this world is no longer holding life back, then what will it allow life to become next long before anything changed in form or scale? The earth had already begun to shift in ways that no creature could see. The transformation did not arrive with sound or movement, but through conditions that quietly rewrote the limits of life. The air itself was different, richer than it would ever be again, filled with an abundance that settled into every leaf and every drop of water. It did not announce its presence, yet it touched everything, shaping bodies before they had the chance to grow. In the vast wetlands that stretched across continents, water and land blended into a single breathing system. Rivers did not rush with urgency. They wandered slowly, spreading into endless marshes where life could linger and expand. Plants grew thick and tall, rising toward a sky that rarely changed. Their roots sank deep into saturated soil, drawing strength from a world that offered no resistance. Growth was not limited here. It was encouraged, supported, almost invited. There was a quiet stability to this ancient environment. Seasons did not swing wildly, and climates did not shift without warning. The world held its breath in long stretches of balance, giving life the time it needed to explore new forms. In such stillness, small advantages could grow into something greater. A slightly stronger limb, a broader body, a longer reach. Each change had time to settle and spread without being undone. It is easy to imagine that size is something earned through struggle, that creatures become larger because they must fight harder to survive. But in this world, the opposite began to reveal itself. Life did not grow because it was forced to. It grew because nothing held it back. The limits that would later define existence had not yet formed. The environment itself removed the boundaries that usually keep life small. Oxygen moved silently through this world, entering bodies and feeding every process within them. Muscles could work longer, tissues could repair faster, and energy flowed with an ease that would seem impossible in later ages. It was not visible, yet it was constant, like an unseen force guiding life toward possibilities it had never reached before. The air was not simply present, it was active, shaping what could exist and how far it could go. The wetlands responded in the same way. They did not restrict movement, they absorbed it. Water supported weight, allowing bodies to expand without collapse. Food was abundant, carried through slow currents and thick vegetation. There was no urgency to remain small, no pressure forcing life to conserve itself. In this environment, growth was not a risk. It was a natural extension of what was already possible, and so a realization begins to form, almost unnoticed. The giants that would one day appear were not accidents of evolution. They were responses to a world that had quietly changed the rules. Size was never the true barrier. The barrier was always the environment. And here, in this forgotten age, that barrier had been lifted. Nothing enormous has appeared yet, and still the world feels as though it is leaning towards something larger. The silence is no longer empty. It is filled with expectation. Every movement in the water carries a hint of what might come. Every breath taken in that heavy air supports a future not yet seen. It is here, in these hidden conditions, that the direction of life quietly shifts, not through sudden change, but through opportunity. Evolution does not choose randomly. It follows what the world allows, and in this moment the world allows more than it ever has before. The question then begins to settle into the silence, growing clearer with each passing moment. If the world is capable of supporting something larger, something stronger, something beyond what has existed so far, then what will answer that call? What kind of creature will step forward into this open possibility and transform it into reality? The answer is already beginning, not in full form, but in small changes that no one notices yet. And as those changes gather strength in the quiet depths, the first true giants move closer to existence than the world is prepared to understand fully. At first, nothing appears dramatically different. The swamps still stretch endlessly beneath the same heavy sky, and the water still moves with the same quiet patience. Yet within this familiar world, something has begun to change. It does not announce itself with sudden size or overwhelming presence. Instead, it moves slowly, almost carefully, as if testing the limits of what has now become possible. Among the countless small forms of life, a few begin to stand apart. Their bodies are no longer as soft or uncertain. Limbs grow thicker, pressing more confidently against the shifting ground. Movements that once seemed hesitant now carry a sense of direction. These early amphibians do not rush, but they no longer drift aimlessly. They move with purpose, even if that purpose is not yet fully understood. In the shallow edges where water meets land, they linger longer than others. Their bodies adjust to the weight of gravity in new ways, learning to support themselves outside the constant buoyancy of water. Each step onto the soft ground is brief at first, almost experimental. But over time, those steps become more frequent, more controlled. What was once an uncertain boundary begins to feel like an extension of their world. Their bodies respond quietly to these changes. Limbs strengthen with repeated movement. Bones grow more stable, supporting greater weight. Heads lift slightly higher above the surface, allowing them to observe a world that had once been out of reach. These are not sudden transformations, but gradual shifts, layered over countless generations. Each small improvement builds upon the last, forming something that begins to feel different, even if it is difficult to define. There is a quiet tension in these movements, a sense that something is forming beneath the surface of ordinary life. These creatures are no longer confined to the patterns that shaped those before them. They are exploring, adapting, and slowly expanding their presence in ways that had not been possible until now. And with each small success, the boundary of what life can become stretches just a little further. It becomes clear, though not all at once, that these changes are not temporary. They are not isolated experiments that will fade with time. They are part of a direction, a gradual shift that is leading somewhere specific. The world has opened a path, and these creatures are beginning to follow it. Their size increases, not dramatically at first, but enough to be noticed in the stillness of the swamp. Bodies grow broader, movements heavier, yet more controlled. The water supports them, but it no longer defines them completely. They exist between two worlds, drawing strength from both, becoming something that neither fully aquatic nor fully terrestrial creatures have been before. And still, nothing feels sudden. The change is so slow that it almost escapes attention. There are no sharp moments of transformation, no clear dividing line between what was and what will be. Instead, there is only a steady progression, a quiet accumulation of strength, stability, and presence. This is how the first giants begin, not through sudden emergence, but through persistence. Hidden in plain sight, growing within a world that now allows them to become more than what came before. In the dim light of the swamp, one such creature rests beneath the surface. Its body is larger than the others, its form more defined, its presence heavier in the water. It does not move quickly. It does not need to. It waits, still and patient, its shape barely visible beneath the dark reflection above. To anything passing nearby, it might appear as nothing more than part of the water itself, but it is not. It is something new, something that carries the quiet weight of what is to come. Because the age of giants does not begin with a single moment. It begins like this, in silence, with a presence that is felt before it is fully seen. And as more of these creatures emerge, growing slowly within the same hidden pattern, the balance of this ancient world begins to shift in ways that no living thing can yet understand. The silence does not disappear. It changes. What was once calm and uncertain now carries a different kind of stillness, one filled with awareness. The swamps remain vast, stretching beneath the same heavy skies, but something within them has shifted. The water no longer feels empty. It feels occupied, watched, controlled. Beneath the dark surface, movement has become deliberate. No longer cautious, no longer experimental. It is confident. The creatures that once tested the edges of land and water have grown into something else entirely. Their bodies are larger now, heavier, shaped by generations of quiet adaptation. Broad heads rest just below the surface, barely disturbing the water. Their eyes sit high, observing without revealing themselves. Limbs, once uncertain, now hold firm strength, capable of pushing through mud, or anchoring in stillness. They do not rush, because they no longer need to. In this world, speed is not power, presence is. Along the edges of rivers and within the depths of endless wetlands, these amphibians have become the defining force. They do not announce themselves. They do not display dominance through constant movement. Instead, they disappear into their environment so completely that their existence is only understood in moments, brief, sudden, irreversible. A ripple where there should be none, a shadow that was not there before, a silence that feels heavier than it should. And then, without warning, motion. The strike is fast, but it is not chaotic. It is precise, controlled, shaped by a body designed for this exact moment. jaws close, with a force that ends movement. Instantly, the water settles again as quickly as it was disturbed, returning to stillness as if nothing had happened at all. This is how they rule. Not through constant action, but through certainty, through the knowledge that within this environment they are unmatched. There is a strange truth hidden here, one that feels almost unfamiliar. When we imagine the rulers of ancient Earth, we think of towering reptiles, of creatures that walked across land with visible dominance. But this world belongs to something else entirely, something quieter, something older. Before those later rulers ever existed, these swamps were already claimed. The amphibians have taken control not by expanding into every environment, but by mastering the one that matters most in this age. Water is everywhere here. It connects rivers, fills lowlands, spreads into endless marshes, and within that water they are not just inhabitants, they are the system itself. Everything moves around them, whether it realizes it or not. Smaller creatures adapt their paths, avoiding certain areas without understanding why. The shape of life itself begins to shift in response to their presence. Even the stillness of the swamp carries their influence, as if the environment has learned to breathe with them. They are not isolated predators. They are a network of control spread across vast landscapes, each one reinforcing the dominance of the other. And yet they remain almost invisible. That is what makes their rule so complete. There are no constant displays of power, no obvious signs of authority, only a quiet certainty that within these waters nothing exists beyond their reach. Time moves forward, but their presence does not weaken, it deepens. With each passing generation, their forms become more refined, their movements more efficient, their role more secure. The swamps are no longer places where life experiments. They are places where life is decided, and still the world beyond them remains unaware. There are no towering footprints across dry land to mark their dominance, no distant roars echoing through forests. Their rule exists in silence, hidden beneath the surface, shaping an entire era without needing to be seen. It is easy to miss them, even in their own time, but that does not make them any less powerful, because long before the creatures we remember took their first steps, this world was already ruled, not by something loud or overwhelming, but by something patient, precise, and perfectly adapted to the environment that created it. And now that their dominance is clear, the question begins to shift. How do such rulers live within this world they control so completely? Because power like this does not exist without limits, and even in a world shaped for them. Survival is never as simple as it first appears. The swamp breathes slowly, as if the entire world has settled into a rhythm that no one dares to disturb. The water lies dark and still, its surface broken only by the faintest ripples, spreading outward in gentle circles before disappearing again into silence. Nothing appears urgent here. Nothing seems out of place beneath that quiet surface. A presence waits. It does not move, it does not need to. Its body rests within the water as if it has always belonged there, its shape blending so perfectly with the shadows that it becomes part of the swamp itself. Only the eyes remain just above the surface, steady and unblinking, watching without revealing intention. Time stretches. Small creatures approach the water's edge, drawn by the same quiet that hides the danger below. They move cautiously, but not cautiously enough. The swamp has taught them to expect stillness, not what waits within it. Each step brings them closer, each ripple fading too quickly to raise alarm. The predator does not react immediately. It waits, allowing the moment to form completely. There is no rush, no wasted motion. Survival here is not about speed alone. It is about timing. And then, in a single instant, the world breaks. The water erupts with sudden force, the still surface collapsing into motion as jaws rise from below. There is no struggle, no prolonged chase. Strike is precise, final, shaped by countless generations that have refined this moment into something nearly perfect. The water closes again just as quickly, returning to calm as if nothing had happened. Silence settles once more. This is how life continues here, not through constant action, but through moments that interrupt stillness and then disappear. Every creature within this world understands, in some instinctive way, that movement carries risk, that the surface is never as empty as it seems. For the giants, this way of life is not a choice, it is a necessity. Their bodies, large and powerful, are built for these environments, but they are also bound to them. The water supports their weight, cools their form, and allows them to move with efficiency that would not exist on land. Without it, their strength becomes a burden. Their size, once an advantage, begins to work against them. They do not wander far from these waters because they cannot. Temperature shapes their existence in ways that cannot be ignored. The warmth of the environment allows their bodies to function, to react, to strike with precision. A shift too far in either direction brings consequences they cannot control. They are powerful, but they are not independent of the world that sustains them, and so their lives become a balance, carefully maintained without awareness. They hunt when conditions allow. They rest when the environment demands it. Every action is guided, not by decision, but by limitation. There is a quiet vulnerability hidden within their dominance. They appear unstoppable within the water, unmatched in their ability to control what enters their domain. But that control has boundaries. It exists only as long as the world around them remains stable. Only as long as the swamps remain full, the air remains heavy, and the balance of their environment does not shift. The illusion of permanence begins to soften here. Even the strongest presence, even the most perfectly adapted form, exists within rules it cannot change. The giants do not question these limits. They cannot. But those limits are there, shaping every moment of their existence, waiting quietly in the background. And as the swamp returns once again to stillness, as the surface smooths and the shadows settle, it becomes clear that survival in this world is not guaranteed by size alone. It depends on silence, on patience, on a single perfect moment that must arrive again and again without fail. Because if that moment is missed, if the balance shifts even slightly, then even the rulers of this world must face something they cannot overpower. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, the world is beginning to change in ways that will test those limits more than they have ever been tested before at first. Nothing seems different. The swamps still stretch beneath the same heavy sky, their waters dark and quiet, their edges softened by thick vegetation. The giants remain where they have always been, resting beneath the surface, moving only when the moment calls for it. To any observer, the world appears unchanged, steady, almost permanent. But change does not begin with something obvious. It begins with something small. The water pulls back, not suddenly, but by an amount so slight it is almost impossible to notice. Shorelines shift by inches, then by more, leaving behind patches of exposed ground that were once submerged. The mud dries at the edges, forming cracks where there were none before. It does not seem important. It does not demand attention, and yet it continues. The air, once heavy and consistent, begins to vary in ways that feel unfamiliar. There are moments when it carries less warmth, when the balance that once held steady begins to loosen. These changes do not arrive with force. They drift in quietly, blending into the rhythm of the world so completely that nothing reacts at first. Life continues unaware. The giants still wait beneath the surface, still strike with the same precision, still dominate the waters that remain. Their presence has not weakened. Their power has not faded, but the space they rely on begins to shift around them, slowly narrowing in ways they cannot control. Along the edges of their domain, something else appears. Small at first, almost insignificant, new forms of life begin to move through areas that were once too unstable to inhabit. They do not enter the deep waters where the giants rule. They remain at the boundaries, in places where the land is firmer, where the water no longer defines every movement. They do not challenge the giants directly. They do not need to. They simply exist in places the giants cannot fully reach. The change is subtle, but it carries weight. The world is no longer shaped entirely around a single way of life. It is beginning to open into something more complex, more divided. What was once a continuous system of water and swamp begins to separate, creating spaces where different rules apply. The giants remain powerful within their environment, but their environment is no longer everything. This is where the shift begins to take form, not through confrontation, not through sudden loss, but through quiet reduction. The waters that once stretched endlessly now pause, break, and reform in smaller patterns. The stability that allowed life to grow without limit begins to waver, just enough to introduce uncertainty. And uncertainty changes everything. There is a strange realization hidden within this slow transformation. The same conditions that once removed limitations are now beginning to create them. The abundance that allowed growth is no longer as constant. The balance that once supported dominance is no longer guaranteed. Nothing has collapsed, nothing has ended, but something has begun. The giants continue their lives, unaware of the larger pattern forming around them. They still hunt, still wait, still exist as the defining presence within their waters. But those waters are changing, and with them, the foundation of their dominance begins to shift. It is not a dramatic moment. It is not something that can be pointed to and named. It is a direction. A quiet movement of the world itself, turning slightly away from what it once supported and towards something new that has not yet fully emerged. And as this change continues, as the edges expand and the conditions evolve, the question begins to take shape in the silence. If the world is no longer shaped entirely for the giants, then what is it beginning to shape instead? The answer is not here yet. It exists just beyond what can be seen, forming slowly within the same hidden processes that once gave rise to the giants themselves. And as the old balance continues to shift, a new one is already beginning to take its place, waiting for the moment when it will no longer remain unnoticed. The change does not begin with a giant. It begins with something small enough to ignore. Along the edges of the shrinking wetlands, where the water no longer spreads as far as it once did, the ground begins to hold its shape. It is firmer here, less forgiving, marked by patches of dry earth that remain untouched by the slow movements of the swamp. For a long time, these places have existed without meaning empty spaces where life hesitates to remain. Now, something lingers. A small creature moves across the surface, its body low, its motion steady and controlled. It does not slide back toward the water. It does not hesitate at the boundary. It continues forward, as if the absence of water no longer defines where it can exist. At first, this seems unimportant. The giants remain in their waters, unchanged, still powerful within their domain. The swamp still dominates the landscape. Nothing has been replaced. Nothing has been challenged. And yet, something fundamental has shifted. These new creatures do not return to the water in the same way. They do not rely on it for every stage of their lives. Where earlier forms must always circle back tied to moisture for survival and reproduction, these beings carry something different within them. Their eggs do not dissolve or fail outside of water. They remain intact, protected, capable of surviving on land. It is a small detail, easy to overlook, but it changes everything, because for the first time, life is no longer anchored. There is no need to remain near the edges of swamps, no need to depend on the slow, uncertain reach of water. The boundary that once defined existence begins to lose its meaning. What was once a limit becomes a choice. The movement is quiet. There are no sudden expansions, no visible takeover of the land. These creatures do not rush outward in waves. They spread slowly, almost cautiously, stepping into spaces that were previously unreachable. Dry ground, once empty, begins to hold life. The difference is subtle, but it carries weight. Where amphibians move with the constant presence of water shaping every action, these creatures move with a different kind of freedom. Their bodies retain moisture. Their forms are built to endure variation, not avoid it. They are not confined to a single environment. They adapt as they move. This is where the shift becomes clear, though it still hides beneath the surface of ordinary change. The advantage is not size. It is not strength. It is independence. The giants remain larger, stronger, unmatched within their waters. But they are bound. Every movement, Every moment of survival depends on the stability of their environment. These smaller creatures carry something the giants do not. They are not limited in the same way. The world beyond the swamps begins to open, not dramatically, but steadily. Areas that once existed without purpose now become part of a growing network of life. The land no longer feels separate from the water. It becomes an extension of possibility. And still, the giants do not respond. They do not need to, not yet. Their dominance remains intact within the spaces they control. Nothing has taken that from them, but something has changed in a way that cannot be reversed. The balance of life is no longer centered in one place. It is spreading. There is a quiet realization hidden within this movement, one that does not reveal itself all at once. Power is no longer defined only by what controls the present. It begins to depend on what can move beyond it. These creatures do not challenge the giants directly. They do not confront them within the waters where they are strongest. Instead, they expand into the spaces where the giants cannot follow easily. And in doing so, they begin to reshape the world itself. The shift is not complete, it is not even obvious, but it has begun. Because once life no longer needs the water, the boundaries that once defined everything begin to disappear. And as more of these creatures move quietly across the firm ground, spreading into places untouched by the old rulers, the direction of the world changes with them. Not suddenly, not dramatically, but with a certainty that cannot be undone. The question no longer rests on what exists now, but on what this freedom will allow next. Because a world that is no longer limited to water is a world that can become something entirely different. Beyond the edge of the swamp, the world feels different. The air is lighter here, less burdened by constant moisture. The ground holds its shape, no longer shifting beneath every step. Water still exists, but it no longer defines everything. It gathers in places rather than spreading endlessly, leaving behind stretches of land that remain dry for longer than before. For the giants, these regions offer little. Their bodies, shaped by water and supported by it, do not move with the same ease across this firm ground. The distance from the swamp is not measured in space alone, but in possibility. The further the land extends, the less it belongs to them. But something else moves there. Small figures cross the dry surface with a steadiness that feels unfamiliar in this ancient world. Their movements are not hesitant. They do not pause at the boundary where water fades into soil. They continue forward as if the change in terrain holds no real consequence. They carry the moisture they need within themselves. Their bodies do not demand constant contact with water. Where the giants depend on their environment, these creatures adjust to it. The difference is quiet, but it grows with every step they take. At first, their presence is scattered. A single path across open ground, a brief movement between patches of vegetation, a life lived in places that once held nothing at all. It would be easy to overlook them, to assume they are no more important than any other small form of life. But they do not remain still. They spread, not in waves, not in sudden expansion, but in a steady, almost unnoticeable way. Each generation reaches slightly further, occupying areas that had once been beyond reach. The land, once empty, begins to fill with movement. And as it does, the world begins to divide. The swamps remain dense, heavy, and controlled by the giants. Within those waters, nothing has changed. Their dominance is still complete, their presence still absolute. But beyond those waters, another system is forming, one that does not rely on the same rules. The contrast becomes clearer over time. In the wetlands, life is shaped by stillness, by patience, by the need to remain within a stable environment. Every action is tied to the presence of water, every movement guided by the limits it creates. On the dry land, movement is different. It is not bound in the same way. It adapts, it shifts with changing conditions. Rather than resisting them, the creatures that move here do not need the world to remain constant. They survive because they can adjust when it does not. This is where the shift in power begins, though it is not yet visible as dominance. The giants are still larger, still stronger, still unmatched within their domain. But their world, once everything, is becoming only part of a larger whole. The importance of that world begins to narrow, not through loss but through expansion elsewhere. Dominance, it turns out, is not only about control, it is about reach, and the reach of these smaller creatures grows with each passing moment. They move into spaces the giants cannot easily follow. They live in conditions that would weaken or limit those bound to water. They do not replace the giants, not yet, but they extend beyond them, quietly, steadily, without confrontation. There is something unsettling in this kind of change. Nothing dramatic signals the shift. No sudden collapse, no visible conflict. Only a widening distance between what was once central and what is becoming increasingly important. The world is no longer focused in one place. It is expanding outward, and as it does, the balance that once seemed stable begins to stretch in ways that cannot be reversed. The swamps remain powerful, but they are no longer the entire story. They are part of a larger system that is slowly redefining itself. Across the dry land, movement continues. More creatures follow the same pattern, spreading into new areas, adapting to conditions that would have once ended their existence. The ground that was once silent now carries life in quiet motion, unseen by those who remain within the waters. And the question begins to form again, not with urgency, but with quiet certainty. If life continues to expand beyond the reach of the giants, then what happens when those expanding worlds begin to overlap with the ones they still control, because expansion does not continue forever without consequence? At some point, the boundaries begin to meet. And when they do, the balance that has held until now will face something it has never encountered before. The boundary between worlds does not remain empty for long. Where the water thins and the land begins to hold, a narrow space forms, neither fully swamp nor fully dry ground. It is here, in this uncertain place, that different ways of life begin to meet. Not in sudden conflict, not in visible confrontation, but in quiet overlap. The giants still move within these edges. Their bodies rest beneath shallow waters, their presence extending outward just enough to maintain control. They remain powerful here, though the environment feels less certain than before. The water is thinner, the ground less forgiving, the balance more delicate. And within that same space, something else appears. Smaller forms move along the edges, crossing ground the giants cannot fully claim. They do not enter the deeper waters where strength would fail them. Instead, they remain just beyond that reach, where the land offers stability and the air carries less weight. They are not here to challenge directly. They do not need to be. The competition does not begin with a fight. It begins with presence. A place once used by one becomes shared by another. A source of food becomes less certain. Movement becomes more cautious, not because of direct threat, but because of shifting patterns. The world itself begins to feel more crowded, though nothing appears dramatically different. The giants still hunt, still wait, still strike with the same precision that defined their dominance. But the conditions surrounding those moments begin to change. Prey moves differently, avoiding certain paths, lingering in areas that are less accessible to the water-bound predators. The balance adjusts. Not all at once, not enough to signal danger, but enough to alter the rhythm that once felt stable. This is how the change begins to take hold, not through overpowering force, but through subtle advantage. The smaller creatures do not match the giants in strength. They do not replace them in the waters. But they exist in more places, move through more environments, and adapt to conditions that shift without warning. They are not limited in the same way, and over time that difference begins to matter. The giants remain where they are strongest, but those places become only part of a larger system. The edges, once extensions of their domain, become shared spaces. And shared spaces do not belong entirely to anyone. There is a quiet tension in this coexistence. No dramatic encounters define it. No clear moment marks its beginning. But something has changed in a way that cannot return to what it was before. The certainty that once defined the giants' control begins to soften, not through loss, but through division. The world is no longer shaped entirely around them. It is adjusting to include something else. And in that adjustment, a deeper truth begins to emerge. Dominance does not always end with defeat. It can fade through displacement, through the slow movement of life into spaces that were once controlled by another. It can dissolve not through violence, but through change. The giants are not being destroyed, they are being outpaced. Their strength remains, but it is tied to conditions that no longer define the entire world. Their presence is still powerful, but it is no longer absolute. Each step taken beyond their reach reduces the importance of what they control. And yet, they do not see it. They cannot. Their lives continue within the patterns that have always sustained them. They hunt, they wait, they exist as they always have. But the world around them is shifting in ways that those patterns cannot fully respond to. There is something unsettling in this kind of change. No clear warning, no visible threat. Only a slow reorganization of life itself, moving quietly toward a future that feels inevitable, even if it has not yet arrived. And as the edges continue to expand, as more creatures move into the spaces beyond the swamp, the question no longer feels distant. It feels close. If the giants are not being defeated but slowly replaced, then how long can their dominance remain before it becomes something remembered rather than something real? Because the shift has already begun. And once it reaches a certain point, there will be no way to return to what once was. Only a new balance, shaped by forces that do not need to conquer in order to take control. The change does not arrive with a single moment. There is no sudden silence, no collapse that signals the end of what once was. Instead, the world begins to shift in ways so gradual they almost escape notice. The swamps still exist, the rivers still move, and the giants still rest beneath the surface. But something within the rhythm has begun to loosen. The water does not vanish, it withdraws. At first it pulls back only slightly, leaving behind narrow stretches of exposed ground, where there was once only mud and shadow. The edges of wetlands begin to sharpen, no longer blending endlessly into the surrounding land. Pools that once connected now stand apart, separated by distances that slowly widen. It feels like a small change. It is not over time. The separation grows. Rivers alter their paths, cutting deeper into the earth, or shifting away from the lowlands that once fed the swamps. The constant flow that sustained vast wetlands becomes less predictable, less reliable. Some areas remain full, while others begin to dry, their surfaces cracking under a sky that no longer holds the same steady weight. The balance begins to break. For the giants, this shift is not immediately visible. They continue as they always have, moving within the waters that remain, hunting with the same precision, resting with the same quiet patience. Their strength has not diminished. Their presence is still powerful within the spaces they occupy. But those spaces are changing. The water that supports their bodies, that allows them to move with control and efficiency, is no longer everywhere. It gathers into smaller regions, forcing concentration where there was once freedom. The distance between suitable habitats increases, creating boundaries that did not exist before. And within those boundaries, pressure begins to build. The air changes as well, though not in ways that can be easily seen. It no longer holds the same consistency. Warmth varies, moisture fluctuates, and the stability that once allowed life to grow without interruption begins to fade. These are not dramatic shifts. They do not demand attention, but they alter the conditions that life depends on in quiet, persistent ways. For creatures tied to those conditions, even the smallest variation carries weight. The giants do not adapt quickly. They cannot. Their bodies are shaped for a world that no longer exists in the same form. Their reliance on water, once an advantage, begins to reveal its cost. Without constant moisture, their movements slow, their strength becomes harder to maintain, and their ability to move between habitats becomes limited. They are still powerful, but power alone is no longer enough. The wetlands continue to shrink, not entirely, but enough to change the structure of the world. Areas that once supported life without effort now require survival. The difference is subtle, but it grows with time, and as it does, a deeper realization begins to form. The environment that once removed limitations is now creating them. This is not a sudden reversal. It is a gradual turning, a shift in direction that does not need to be announced to be real. The same forces that allowed the giants to grow, to dominate, to exist without constraint, are no longer aligned in their favor. The world is no longer shaped for them. It is becoming something else. The pressure is not immediate, but it is constant. Each generation faces conditions that are slightly less forgiving than the last. Each movement requires more awareness, more effort, more reliance on spaces that continue to narrow. And yet nothing collapses, the giants remain. The swamps still exist. The water has not disappeared, but the certainty is gone. In its place is something quieter, something more difficult to recognize, but impossible to ignore once understood. A slow tightening of the conditions that once allowed life to expand without limit. There is no clear moment when this change begins, only a growing awareness that it is happening, and as the wetlands continue to withdraw, as the rivers shift and the air loses its steady weight, the question settles into the silence once again. What happens to a creature when the world that shaped it begins to disappear? Because this is not a challenge that can be fought or escaped. It is something that surrounds them, reshapes them, and slowly moves beyond what they can endure. And as the environment continues to shift, becoming less stable, less predictable, and less forgiving, the path ahead begins to narrow in ways that cannot be reversed. At first, the giants do not recognize the change as a threat. They respond as they always have, moving toward water when the ground grows dry, settling deeper when the surface becomes uncertain. Their instincts guide them, shaped by generations that have survived within stable conditions. When something shifts, they adjust, not with awareness, but with repetition, and for a time it works. They gather in deeper pools where water remains, where the environment still resembles what it once was. These places become centers of life, holding more movement, more tension than before. The stillness that once defined the swamps begins to feel crowded, filled with presence that was once spread across a wider world. The giants remain powerful here, but power begins to feel different when it must be shared. Where space narrows, competition grows. Movements become less patient, less certain. The quiet balance that once allowed them to wait without urgency begins to strain under the pressure of limited resources. Prey becomes less predictable, less abundant in places that once provided without effort, and so they adjust again. They move more often, searching for conditions that no longer exist in the same way. They push beyond familiar boundaries, into areas where water is shallower, where the ground resists their weight. Each step becomes more demanding, each movement requiring more effort than before. Their size, once effortless within the support of water, begins to feel heavier. It does not slow them immediately. It does not weaken them in a way that can be seen. But it changes the cost of survival. What was once natural now requires more energy, more precision, more dependence on conditions that are no longer guaranteed. The environment is no longer working with them. It is becoming something they must work against. There is a quiet struggle in this transition, one that does not reveal itself through sudden failure, but through increasing difficulty. The giants do not fall all at once. They endure, they continue, but each moment of survival carries a weight that was not there before. Some remain within shrinking waters, holding onto spaces that still support them, even as those spaces become more limited. Others attempt to move outward, testing environments that offer less stability, less certainty. Not all succeed. And still they adapt as far as they can. Their behaviors shift. Their movements become more deliberate. They take fewer risks, conserve energy, rely more heavily on what remains rather than what might be found elsewhere. These adjustments allow them to persist, to continue existing within a world that is no longer fully aligned with their needs. But adaptation is not endless. There is a limit to how much a body can change within the time it is given. A limit to how much behavior can compensate for an environment that is steadily moving away from what it once was. The giants do not fail because they are weak. They struggle because the conditions that shape them are no longer present in the same form. This is where the deeper truth begins to surface. Evolution does not promise survival. It creates what fits the present, not what can endure every possible future. The giants were shaped perfectly for a world that no longer exists, and no amount of strength can fully overcome that reality. They continue, but the direction has changed. Each generation faces a slightly different world, one that demands more than the last. And while some adjust enough to persist, others do not. The difference is not always visible. It unfolds slowly over time, through absence rather than sudden loss. The swamps still hold life. The giants are still there. But something is slipping. Their dominance, once absolute, begins to feel uncertain. Not because they have been defeated, but because the world that sustained them is no longer constant. The balance they depended on has begun to dissolve. And in that quiet dissolution, a realization settles in. No matter how powerful a creature becomes, it cannot carry its world with it. It must exist within it. And when that world changes beyond what it can follow, even the strongest forms of life must face a limit they cannot overcome. Not all at once, but inevitably. There is no single moment when the age of giants ends. No final roar, no sudden silence that marks the boundary between what was and what is about to become. The swamps do not vanish overnight, and the giants do not disappear in a single generation. Instead, the change unfolds in a way that is almost impossible to notice while it is happening. The world continues, but something within it begins to fade. The waters remain, though they no longer stretch as far. The vegetation still rises from the damp ground, though it grows in patterns that feel less certain. Life moves as it always has, but with subtle differences that are difficult to name. And the giants are still there. At least, some of them are. Their presence becomes less frequent, less evenly spread across the landscape. Places that once held movement and quiet power now feel empty. Though nothing seems broken, the absence does not announce itself. It simply exists where something once was and no longer is. This is how an era begins to disappear, not through destruction, but through reduction. Each generation leaves fewer behind. Each habitat supports less than it once did. The spaces between them widen, not dramatically, but enough to change the shape of the world. The giants, once part of a continuous presence, become scattered, their dominance no longer defining the entire landscape. And still, nothing collapses. The swamps do not fall silent. Life does not stop. But the balance shifts, reorganizing itself around what remains. Other creatures move into spaces that were once controlled by the giants, not as invaders, but as participants in a world that is quietly redefining itself. The change is not violent, it is patient. The giants continue to exist, but their role begins to diminish. They are no longer the center of everything. They become part of a larger system that no longer depends on them in the same way. Their presence, once unavoidable, becomes something that can be missed, and often is. There is something deeply unsettling in this kind of disappearance. It does not leave behind a clear memory. It does not create a moment that can be remembered as the end. Instead, it slips away, leaving only fragments behind, a shape in the water that is no longer there, a movement that no longer interrupts the surface, a silence that feels slightly different, though nothing can explain why. Over time, even that awareness fades. The world adjusts completely, settling into a new balance where the absence of the giants is no longer noticed. Life continues, shaped by new conditions, guided by different forms that now fill the spaces that once belonged to something else. And in that quiet adjustment, an entire era disappears. Not erased, but replaced. The traces remain hidden beneath layers of time, preserved in ways that cannot be seen from the surface. But the living world moves forward without them, carrying on as if they were never essential to begin with. This is the final truth of their dominance. It did not end in a moment. It ended in a process, a slow fading, a quiet retreat, a transformation that removed them not through force but through change. The world they ruled no longer exists in the same form, and without that world, their place within it dissolves. There is no final confrontation, no clear ending, only the realization, once it is already complete, that something vast and powerful has slipped beyond the present and into memory. And even that memory will not last forever, because the world does not hold on to what it replaces. It continues. And as the last traces of the giants settle into silence, something else begins to take shape in the space they have left behind. Not as a continuation of what they were, but as something entirely new that will define the next chapter of life on Earth. The world does not pause when an era fades. There is no empty space waiting to be filled, no silence that lingers after the giants disappear. Life continues, moving forward without hesitation, reshaping itself around new possibilities that have already begun to take form. Long before the last traces of the amphibian giants fade from the swamps, something else is already rising. At first, it does not feel like dominance. It feels like presence. Small, steady movements across land that no longer belongs to the water. Creatures that once remained at the edges now move freely across open ground, their bodies shaped not by the need to return, but by the ability to remain. The difference is quiet, but it carries weight. Where the giants were bound to shrinking wetlands, these new forms move without that limitation. Their lives are not anchored to a single environment. They cross dry land with ease, their movements unaffected by the absence of water. They do not depend on stable conditions in the same way. They adapt as those conditions shift, and as the world continues to change, that difference becomes everything. The land, once secondary to the vast wetlands, begins to take on a new importance. It stretches outward, forming environments that no longer support the life that once dominated them. But where one form struggles, another finds opportunity. The reptiles do not rush to claim this world. They grow into it. Their presence expands slowly, following the same quiet pattern that defined their early emergence. Each generation moves slightly further, settles more confidently, adapts more completely to conditions that continue to evolve. They are not replacing the giants through conflict. They are succeeding them through compatibility. The world has changed, and they fit within that change. This is where the shift becomes undeniable. Dominance is no longer tied to the environments that once defined life. It is shaped by the ability to exist beyond them. The reptiles do not need the wetlands to survive. They do not depend on a single system to sustain their lives. They move through a variety of conditions, adjusting as needed, continuing forward without interruption. The advantage is not visible in size or strength. It is visible in reach, and their reach continues to grow. The spaces they occupy expand across the land, connecting environments that were once separate. Where the swamps fragmented, the land remains continuous, offering pathways that extend far beyond what the giants could follow. The reptiles move along these paths, spreading quietly, steadily, until their presence becomes impossible to ignore. The world does not resist this change. It supports it. The same forces that once allowed amphibians to grow now favor something different. Stability has given way to variation, and in that variation, adaptability becomes the defining trait of survival. The reptiles do not overcome the world, they move with it, and in doing so, they become its new foundation. There is a strange sense of inevitability in this transition. It does not feel sudden or forced. It feels as though it was always leading here, as though the rise of one group naturally creates the conditions for another to follow. The fall of the giants is not an ending. It is a continuation. The world does not lose its complexity when one form fades. It reorganizes, shifting its balance, creating space for something new to take shape. The reptiles do not arrive as replacements in a dramatic sense. They emerge as the next expression of what life has become. And as their presence spreads, as their movements define more of the landscape, the age that follows begins to form, not through a single moment, but through a gradual realization. The world is no longer shaped by what once was. It is shaped by what now fits within it. The reptiles do not announce their dominance. They do not need to. Their existence across the land, their ability to persist where others cannot, speaks for itself. The balance has shifted, and with it, the direction of life continues forward. And yet, even as this new age begins to take hold, something of the old world remains, not as dominance, not as control, but as a quiet trace of what once defined everything. Because nothing in this story truly disappears without leaving something behind. And as the reptiles rise into their place within this changing world, the memory of the giants lingers in ways that are not immediately seen, but never entirely gone. The giants are gone, but the world they shaped has not forgotten them. Their absence feels complete at first. The swamps no longer hold their silent presence. The waters no longer carry the same weight of control. Life moves differently now, guided by forms that fit the present, not the past. And yet beneath that surface of change something remains. Not visible, not immediate, but still there. The ground itself holds their memory. Layer by layer beneath the soil and stone, traces of their existence settle into the earth. Bones, impressions, fragments of bodies that once moved through dark waters, preserved without intention. These are not monuments, they are quiet records, left behind by a world that does not pause to remember. But the story they carry does not end with their disappearance. It continues in the structure of what followed. The wetlands they once dominated did not vanish completely. They changed, shifted, adapted to new conditions, but their presence shaped the land in ways that persist. The flow of water, the patterns of vegetation, the balance of ecosystems, all of it carries the imprint of what came before. The giants did not simply exist within their world. They helped define it. Their movements altered the environment. Their presence influenced the behavior of other life, and their role within the system shaped how that system evolved over time. Even in their absence, those effects remain, woven into the structure of a world that has already moved on. There is a quiet truth hidden within this. Nothing in evolution truly disappears. It transforms. The giants are no longer present as living forms, but they exist within the conditions they helped create. The systems that replaced them did not emerge from nothing. They grew from foundations that had already been shaped, already influenced by what existed before. The reptiles that now move across the land inherit a world that was not empty. It was prepared. Prepared by cycles of growth and decline, by the rise and fall of forms that each contributed something to what would come next. The giants in their time were not an ending. They were part of a process that continues long after they are gone. This changes the way their story is understood. They are not failures, not lost rulers whose time ended without meaning. They are a chapter in a larger narrative, one that does not focus on permanence, but on progression. Each form of life builds upon what came before, even if it does not resemble it. The connection is not always visible, but it is always there, in the shape of the land, in the flow of ecosystems, in the patterns that repeat across time. The influence of the past continues. The giants may no longer walk the waters, but the world still carries the marks of where they once were. And in those marks their presence endures. There is something almost unsettling in this kind of memory. It does not exist in a way that can be easily seen or fully understood. It is not a direct continuation, not a clear inheritance. It is a quiet persistence, a foundation that supports what comes next without drawing attention to itself. The earth does not erase its past. It layers it. Each era settles into the one that follows, becoming part of something larger, something that extends far beyond any single form of life. The giants are part of that layering, part of a history that continues to shape the present even as it fades from view. And as the world moves forward, as new forms rise and define their own place within it, the traces of what came before remain, guiding what follows in ways that are rarely noticed. Because the story of life is not built on what survives alone. It is built on everything that has ever existed. And with that understanding, the past no longer feels distant or disconnected. It becomes part of the present and part of whatever comes next. The story does not belong to the giants alone. It does not belong to the reptiles that follow, nor to any single form that rises and claims its place within the world. What has unfolded across these ancient swamps and expanding lands is part of something larger, something that extends far beyond any one era. Life does not move in a straight line. It moves in cycles. The patterns are not obvious at first. They reveal themselves slowly, across spans of time too vast to observe in a single moment. A world forms under certain condition. Life adapts to those conditions, growing, expanding, finding ways to thrive within the limits that exist. Some forms become dominant, shaping the environment around them, defining the balance of life. For a time, that dominance feels complete. It feels permanent, but the conditions do not remain the same. They never do. The world shifts, sometimes slowly, sometimes in ways that are barely noticeable until the change is already complete. What once supported growth begins to introduce limits. What once allowed expansion begins to narrow. And in that shift, the forms that once thrived begin to struggle, not because they have become weaker, but because the world has become different. And as those forms fade, something else begins to rise. Not suddenly, not as a direct replacement, but as a continuation of the same process. New life adapts to the new conditions, expanding into spaces that have opened, shaping the environment in its own way. The cycle repeats, not identically, but with a familiar rhythm that connects each era to the one before it. This is the pattern that lies beneath everything: growth, dominance, decline, renewal. It is not a sequence that happens once. It is a structure that repeats again and again across the history of life on Earth. Each chapter feels unique while it unfolds, each dominant form appearing as though it defines the world completely. But over time, that sense of permanence dissolves. The giants once held that place. The reptiles now begin to take it, and one day they too will face the same shift. There is a quiet realization in this pattern, one that changes how the story is understood. No matter how powerful a species becomes, no matter how completely it shapes its environment, it remains part of a system that is always changing. No dominance is permanent. No control is absolute. Everything that rises is shaped by conditions that will eventually move beyond it. This does not diminish the importance of what came before. It gives it meaning. Each era contributes to the next, not by lasting forever, but by creating the foundation upon which new forms can emerge. The rise and fall of each dominant group is not a failure. It is part of a process that allows life to continue, to adapt, to explore new possibilities. And so the story moves forward, not toward an ending, but toward another beginning. The world continues to shift, the conditions continue to evolve, and life continues to respond. What exists now will not remain unchanged. What feels stable will not last forever. And what replaces it will follow the same pattern, shaped by forces that are always in motion. There is something calming in this understanding. The idea that change is not an interruption, but a constant. That every moment is part of a larger cycle that does not stop, does not pause, does not reach a final point. It simply continues, carrying the story of life forward through time. And as one chapter closes and another begins, the question remains, not as a warning, but as a quiet invitation to wonder. If every dominant species is only temporary, no matter how powerful it seems, then what is forming now that will one day take its place, because the cycle is still moving, and it has not finished yet. When the giants fade, the world does not become empty, it becomes quieter. The vast presence that once defined the swamps no longer fills every space, no longer shapes every movement. The waters still exist, though they are smaller now, more scattered, less certain. The land stretches further, the air shifts more freely, and life continues within this altered world. But it is not the giants who carry the story forward. It is something else. Beneath fallen leaves, within damp soil, in the narrow spaces where water lingers just enough to sustain life, small forms move without drawing attention. They are easy to overlook, their bodies soft, their movements slow, their presence quiet enough to blend into the background of everything around them. They do not dominate, they persist. These smaller amphibians do not rely on the vast wetlands that once supported the giants. They do not require endless water or stable conditions across large distances. Instead, they exist within fragments, small pockets of moisture, hidden environments where the larger forms could never fully survive. They adapt by remaining close to what is necessary and nothing more. Their lives are not built on control or expansion. They are built on balance. They move carefully through their environment, avoiding extremes, adjusting to subtle changes, responding to conditions that shift without warning. They are not powerful in the way the giants once were, but they do not need to be. There is a quiet strength in their existence, one that does not announce itself but becomes clear over time. While the giants struggled against a changing world, these smaller forms moved with it. Where the environment narrowed, they followed. Where conditions shifted, they adjusted. They did not resist change. They survived within it. This is where the deeper truth begins to reveal itself. Survival is not always tied to size or strength. It does not belong only to those who dominate their environment. Sometimes it belongs to those who can remain unnoticed, who can exist without needing the world to remain constant. The giants were shaped for a specific kind of world. These smaller creatures are shaped for variation. They do not require stability across vast regions. They do not depend on a single system to sustain them. Their needs are smaller, their presence lighter, their ability to adapt more immediate. They can exist in places where the larger forms would fail, simply because they do not demand as much from the world around them, and so they endure. Not as rulers, not as dominant forces, but as continuations of a lineage that has found a different path forward. The world has changed, but they remain, carrying within them the quiet persistence of forms that have learned to survive without control. There is something almost invisible about this kind of endurance. It does not leave behind clear marks. It does not reshape the landscape in dramatic ways. It continues quietly generation after generation, maintaining a presence that can easily be missed if one is not looking closely. But it is there, and it matters because while the giants have disappeared, their lineage has not vanished completely. It has narrowed, shifted into smaller forms, adapted into something that no longer resembles what it once was, yet still carries the essence of its origin. The story does not end, it changes shape. In the dim light beneath a layer of leaves, a small amphibian rests, its body still, its presence barely noticeable against the damp earth. It does not need to move quickly. It does not need to claim space or assert control. It only needs to exist. And in that quiet existence, it carries a connection to a world that no longer exists in the same form. A living echo of an age that once defined everything, now reduced to something smaller, quieter, but still present. The giants are gone, but not everything they were has been lost. And as these small survivors continue their quiet lives within a changing world, the story begins to expand once again, moving beyond what has disappeared and toward what still remains. Hidden in ways that are only now beginning to be understood, the past does not always stay behind. It lingers not in the form we expect, but in fragments that continue quietly within the present. The world that once held vast swamps and towering amphibians has changed beyond recognition, yet something of it remains, hidden in places that feel ordinary. A small movement near the edge of water, a body resting in damp shade, a shape so familiar that it seems simple, almost unremarkable. And yet, within that simplicity, something ancient persists. Modern amphibians move through the world in ways that feel calm, almost slow, as if time affects them differently. Their skin remains soft and moist, drawing in water from the environment, just as it did millions of years ago. They do not carry the protections that other creatures have developed. They remain exposed, connected directly to the conditions around them. It seems like a limitation, but it is also a memory. Their bodies have not completely left the past behind. They still depend on moisture, still return to water to reproduce, still exist within a balance that has remained unchanged for an unimaginable length of time. While other forms of life have transformed, adapted, and moved further away from their origins, these creatures have remained closer to where the story began. They are not unchanged, but they are not entirely new. There is something almost unsettling in that continuity. The idea that a creature moving quietly through a modern forest or resting beside a small pool of water carries within it traits that were shaped in a world long gone. Traits that once supported giants now exist in smaller forms, still functioning, still relevant in environments that have evolved around them. The ancient world has not disappeared. It has been reduced. It survives in pieces, in patterns that remain embedded within life itself. The connection is not always obvious. It does not reveal itself unless it is considered closely. But once seen, it becomes difficult to ignore. The slow movement of a frog along damp ground is not just a simple action. It is part of a story that extends far beyond the present moment. The way a salamander seeks shelter beneath leaves, avoiding dryness, maintaining the delicate balance its body requires, reflects conditions that existed long before modern ecosystems took shape. These behaviors are not recent adaptations. They are continuations, echoes. There is a quiet realization in this connection. The distance between past and present is not as complete as it seems. Time has changed the world, reshaped landscapes, altered climates, and introduced entirely new forms of life. But it has not erased everything. Some traits remain, carried forward not because they dominate, but because they still fit within certain spaces. The ancient world does not survive everywhere, but it survives somewhere, and in those places it continues without needing recognition. It does not announce itself as a remnant of something greater. It simply exists following the same patterns that once supported a much larger presence. This changes how the present is seen. What appears ordinary begins to feel connected to something much older. The small creatures that move quietly through modern environments are no longer just part of the current world. They are part of a much longer story, one that has not ended, only shifted. There is something calming in this idea. The sense that even as the world changes, not everything is lost. That certain forms, certain traits, certain ways of existing can persist through time, adapting just enough to remain while everything else transforms around them. The giants are gone, but what they were has not vanished completely. It continues in quieter forms. And as this connection becomes clearer, as the present begins to feel like an extension of the past rather than something separate from it, the question begins to take shape once more. Why do some lineages endure, carrying fragments of ancient worlds forward, while others fade completely, leaving only traces behind because survival is not only about continuing. It is about how that continuation fits within a world that never stops changing. Not all life continues. Some forms endure across vast stretches of time, adapting just enough to remain part of a changing world. Others, no matter how dominant they once were, fade slowly until nothing of them remains except traces hidden beneath the ground. The difference between these outcomes is not always obvious, and it is rarely decided in a single moment. It unfolds quietly, shaped by conditions that are always shifting. At first, it might seem that survival belongs to the strongest. The largest bodies, the most powerful movements, the ability to control an environment completely. These qualities appear to define success. For a time, they do. The giants once held that position, their presence shaping entire ecosystems, their dominance unquestioned within the world they occupied. But strength is only effective within the conditions that support it. When those conditions change, strength can become a burden. A large body requires more energy, more stability, more resources that may no longer be available. What once allowed a creature to dominate can begin to limit its ability to adapt. The same traits that once ensured survival can quietly become obstacles when the environment shifts beyond what they were designed for. This is where another pattern begins to emerge. Simplicity often endures smaller forms, less dependent on specific conditions, can adjust more easily when the world changes. They do not require the same level of stability. They do not depend on a single system to sustain them. Instead, they exist within a range of possibilities, moving through variation rather than resisting it. They are not as powerful, but they are more flexible. Flexibility does not appear as strength. It does not dominate or control. It adapts, shifts, responds to what is present rather than what once existed. And over time, that ability becomes more important than any single advantage. There is a quiet balance between specialization and adaptability. To specialize is to become perfectly suited for a specific environment, to refine every trait toward a single purpose. It creates efficiency, precision, and dominance within that space. But it also creates dependence. When that environment changes, the specialization that once defined success becomes difficult to maintain. To remain adaptable is to accept variation, to exist within a wider range of conditions without fully committing to one. It may limit immediate dominance, but it allows for persistence across change. Neither path is permanent. Both are part of the same process. Life does not choose one over the other. It explores both again and again across different times and environments. Some forms rise through specialization, reaching heights of dominance that seem unshakable. Others persist quietly, adapting without drawing attention, continuing through conditions that reshape everything around them. And over time the balance shifts. What once dominated fades. What once remained unnoticed continues. This is not a failure of the forms that disappear. It is not a mistake or a loss in the way it might seem. It is part of how life moves forward, reshaping itself in response to a world that never remains still. Extinction is not an end in isolation. It is part of a transition. Each disappearance creates space, alters conditions, changes the structure of ecosystems in ways that allow something else to emerge. The world does not stop when one form fades. It adjusts, reorganizes, continues with what remains and what can adapt. There is something almost calming in this understanding. The idea that survival is not about overcoming everything, but about fitting within what exists. That strength alone is not enough, and that even the most powerful forms are part of a larger system that determines what continues and what does not. And as the patterns of survival and disappearance become clearer, as the quiet rules that shape life reveal themselves, the story begins to move forward once again. Because from what fades, something always rises, not as a replacement, but as the next expression of a world that is constantly changing, constantly forming new possibilities from what once was. The silence does not linger as long as it seems. For a brief moment, the world feels open, as if something vast has stepped away and left behind a space that has yet to be understood. The waters lie still, the land stretches further than before, and the absence of the giants creates a quiet that feels almost complete. But this stillness is not emptiness. It is only the beginning of something that has already started to take shape beneath the surface. Life does not pause, it adjusts. At first, the change is subtle, almost impossible to notice unless one looks closely. Small plants begin to spread into areas where water once dominated, their roots finding stability in soil that is no longer constantly saturated. Their growth is slow but steady, forming new layers across the land, reshaping the ground in ways that gradually influence everything around them. The water itself becomes calmer in places, no longer disturbed by the movements that once defined it, allowing smaller forms of life to move within it with less interruption. These changes do not happen all at once. They unfold in fragments, scattered across the landscape, each small shift building upon the last. A patch of vegetation expands. A shallow pool becomes home to new movement. A dry stretch of land holds life where none existed before. None of these moments feel significant on their own, yet together they begin to form a new pattern, one that does not resemble what came before, but grows from it. There is no attempt to restore the past. The world does not return to the conditions that once supported the giants. Instead, it reorganizes itself, using what remains to build something different. The structure of life begins to change, not through sudden replacement, but through gradual adjustment. Relationships between land, water, and living forms shift into new configurations, creating systems that are more varied, more flexible, and less dependent on a single dominant presence. This is where a deeper understanding begins to emerge. What appears as loss is not the end of a system, but the transformation of it. The absence of one form of life does not weaken the world. It creates space for others to expand, to connect, and to form new balances that reflect the conditions of the present rather than the past. Plants continue to spread, shaping the land with quiet persistence. Their presence stabilizes the soil, influences the flow of water, and creates environments that support other forms of life. Smaller creatures move through these spaces, feeding, adapting, and interacting in ways that gradually increase the complexity of the system. What begins as scattered activity becomes a network, each part connected to the others in ways that grow stronger over time. The world is not being rebuilt from nothing, it is being rewritten from what remains. This distinction matters. Nothing is lost completely. The processes that shaped the past continue to operate, guiding the formation of what comes next. Growth follows opportunity. Life expands where conditions allow, and systems form in response to the environment as it exists now. The result is not a return, but a continuation, shaped by new conditions, but rooted in the same underlying patterns. There is a quiet sense of renewal in this process, one that does not demand attention, but becomes clear through time. The world finds balance again, not by recreating what once was, but by allowing something new to emerge in its place. The absence that once felt significant becomes part of the foundation for what follows, no longer a gap, but a beginning. And as these new ecosystems settle into their form, As the scattered fragments of life become structured systems, the direction of change becomes clearer. The conditions that now define the world begin to favour certain forms over others, shaping the path forward in ways that are not yet fully visible but already underway. Because in every ending, something has already begun. And as the world continues to move, quietly and steadily, that beginning grows, preparing to define the next chapter of life in a way that feels both new and deeply familiar at the same time as the world settles into its new balance. Something begins to move through it with increasing certainty. Not with sudden force, not with overwhelming presence, but with a quiet expansion that becomes more difficult to ignore over time. The land once secondary to the vast wetlands now carries a growing share of life. And within that expanding space, new forms begin to define what survival looks like. These creatures do not arrive as conquerors. They do not replace what came before through direct conflict. Instead, they spread into the conditions that now exist, shaping themselves around the world as it has become rather than as it once was. Their movements are steady, their presence widening across landscapes that continue to shift, and their success lies not in strength alone, but in the way they respond to change. They are not bound to water in the same way as those that came before. They move across dry ground without hesitation, their bodies retaining what they need to survive, their lives no longer anchored to a single environment. Where the giants required stability, these creatures adapt to variation. Where the past demanded dependence, the present rewards flexibility. This difference begins to reshape everything. The environments they enter are not uniform. Some are dry and open, others dense with vegetation, others still caught between land and water. Yet across all of these spaces the same pattern emerges. They adjust, they persist, and they expand. Their presence becomes consistent, not because the world remains the same, but because they can exist within its changes. It is here that a deeper shift takes place, one that is not immediately visible, but gradually becomes undeniable. Dominance is no longer defined by control over a single environment. It is defined by the ability to exist across many. The giants once ruled completely within their domain, but their reach was limited by the conditions that sustained them. These new forms do not hold the same kind of concentrated control, but they extend further, connecting regions that were once separate, moving through a world that is no longer centered in one place. Their advantage is not in size, it is in range. And as that range increases, their influence grows with it. They begin to occupy roles that once belonged to others, moving into spaces left behind, filling gaps within the ecosystems that have been reshaped by change. But they do not stop there. They move beyond those roles, exploring possibilities that did not exist before, creating new patterns of life that expand the structure of the world itself. The shift is gradual, but it carries a sense of inevitability. No single moment defines their rise. No clear boundary marks the point at which they become dominant. Instead, it is recognized through accumulation, through the steady presence of these creatures across more and more environments, until it becomes clear that they are no longer part of the system. They are defining it. This reveals something important about the nature of dominance. It is not passed from one group to another. It is shaped by the world itself. The rulers of the past do not choose who follows them. They do not leave behind a position to be claimed. Instead, the conditions that allowed their rise change, and in that change, a new form emerges that fits what now exists. Dominance is not inherited. It is earned through alignment with the present. And in this moment, the present favours adaptability. The reptiles do not carry the legacy of the giants. They do not resemble them in form or behaviour. Yet they rise within the same world, shaped by the same processes, responding to conditions that now support a different kind of success. There is a quiet forward movement in this transition, a sense that the story is not repeating, but continuing in a new direction. The world has changed and life has changed with it, creating a new balance that reflects what is now possible. And as these new dominant forms spread further, connecting environments and shaping ecosystems, the pattern becomes clearer. This is not the first time the world has shifted in this way, and it will not be the last. Because the rise of one form always carries within it the beginning of another change, one that has yet to fully reveal itself but is already forming within the same processes that have guided every transformation before it. When the story is viewed from a distance, the details begin to soften. The swamps, the giants, the slow expansion of new forms across the land, each of these moments feels distinct when experienced on its own. Each carries its own sense of importance, its own identity shaped by the conditions of its time. But as the view widens, as the focus moves beyond a single era, something else begins to emerge beneath those details. A pattern. It is not obvious at first. It does not reveal itself through a single event or a clear sequence. Instead, it appears through repetition, through the quiet recognition that what has happened once begins to resemble what happens again, even if the forms and environments are different. Life rises within certain conditions. It grows, expands, and eventually comes to define the world around it. For a time, that dominance feels complete, as though it will continue without interruption. The systems it shapes become stable, the balance it creates seems secure, and the presence of those dominant forms feels permanent. But the conditions do not remain the same. They shift, sometimes slowly, sometimes in ways that are only understood once the change is already complete. What once supported growth begins to introduce limits. What once allowed expansion begins to narrow. And as those changes unfold, the forms that once thrived begin to struggle, not because they have failed, but because the world has moved beyond them. And from that shift, something new begins to rise. It does not appear suddenly. It does not replace what came before in a single moment. It emerges gradually, shaped by the new conditions, adapting in ways that align with what the world has become. Over time, it expands, connects, and eventually takes on the role that once belonged to another. The pattern repeats. Growth, dominance, decline, renewal. Each stage flows into the next, not as separate events, but as parts of a continuous process that has been unfolding since life first began. The amphibian giants were part of this pattern. The reptiles that followed are part of it as well, and each form that rises in the future will follow the same rhythm, shaped by conditions that are always changing. This is where a deeper understanding begins to form. History is not a series of isolated events. It is a system. The details change, the forms evolve, the environments shift, but the structure beneath it all remains consistent. Life does not move randomly. It responds to the world as it exists, following patterns that repeat across time, even as the surface of that time continues to transform. There is something both simple and profound in this realization. The rise of one dominant species does not mark a final point. It is part of a sequence that has no fixed end. Each era feels unique, yet it reflects the same underlying process, one that connects the distant past to the present in ways that are not always immediately visible. The giants once seemed permanent. The reptiles now begin to take their place, and one day they too will become part of this pattern, giving way to something shaped by conditions that do not yet fully exist. The repetition does not diminish the importance of each era. It gives it meaning. Each rise and fall contributes to a larger continuity, a story that extends far beyond any single moment or form. The changes that seem final are part of something ongoing, something that does not stop or settle into a permanent state. It continues, and as this continuity becomes clearer, as the patterns that connect different ages begin to take shape, the distance between past and present begins to feel smaller. The same processes that shaped ancient worlds are still active, still guiding the movement of life in ways that are not always seen, but always present. There is a quiet recognition in this understanding. The idea that what has happened before is not separate from what is happening now, and what is happening now is not separate from what will come next, because the pattern does not end. It repeats, and as it continues, shaping each new era from the remains of the last, the question begins to shift once again, moving beyond what has been into what might still unfold. If these patterns have guided life for so long, then what do they reveal about what comes next, because the future is not entirely unknown? It is forming within the same rhythms that have always been there, waiting to take shape in ways that follow a pattern as old as life itself. Power, when it exists, rarely feels temporary. To those who hold it, the world appears stable, structured around their presence, shaped by their influence. The amphibian giants once existed in such a world. Their dominance was not questioned, not because it could not be challenged, but because nothing within their environment required it to be. They were perfectly aligned with the conditions that surrounded them, and within that alignment, their control felt complete. There is a quiet certainty that comes with this kind of existence. When a species fits its world so precisely, it does not experience its power as something fragile. It feels natural, almost inevitable, as though it could not have been otherwise. The giants did not need to assert dominance constantly. They simply existed within it, moving through waters that supported them, hunting within systems that sustained them, living within a balance that required no resistance. From within that perspective, nothing suggests an ending. The environment appears consistent. The patterns of life repeat. The conditions that allow survival remain steady. There is no signal, no clear indication that anything will change, and so the sense of permanence forms, not as an assumption, but as an experience. This is where the illusion begins, because permanence in nature does not exist in the way it appears to those within it. The world is never still, even when it seems to be. Conditions shift slowly, often beyond the awareness of the life forms that depend on them. What feels stable is often only stable within a limited span of time. Beyond that span, change continues, shaping the environment in ways that cannot be predicted from within a single moment. The giants were not aware of this. They could not be. Their lives were shaped by the present, by the conditions that allowed them to thrive. They did not experience the long arc of time that would eventually move beyond those conditions. To them, the world was what it was, and within that world they were unmatched, but the environment does not remain aligned forever. The same conditions that create dominance can shift, gradually or unexpectedly, until they no longer support what they once did. And when that shift occurs, power begins to lose its foundation. Not immediately, not in a way that is always visible, but steadily, as the world moves away from what once defined it. This is not a failure of the dominant species. It is a change in the system itself. Every form of life exists within limits, even when those limits are not visible. Those limits are set by the environment, by the conditions that determine what can survive and what cannot. As long as those conditions remain stable, dominance appears permanent. But when they change, the illusion dissolves. The giants did not become weaker. The world became different. And in that difference, their power could no longer sustain itself in the same way. What once felt absolute became conditional. What once seemed unshakable began to shift, not because of a direct challenge, but because the foundation beneath it was no longer the same. There is something deeply unsettling in this realization. The idea that power is not something that can be held indefinitely, that it exists only within a specific set of conditions that are always subject to change. No matter how complete it feels, no matter how stable it appears, it remains temporary. This applies not only to the giants, but to every dominant form that has ever existed. Each one rises within a world that supports it. Each one experiences that support as something lasting, and each one eventually encounters a change that reveals the limits it could not see. The illusion of permanence is not a mistake. It is part of how life experiences itself within a single moment. But beyond that moment, the larger pattern continues, moving forward, reshaping the world in ways that no single species can control or predict. And in that movement, the truth becomes clear, not suddenly, but with a quiet certainty that settles over time. No ruler remains forever, not because it fails, but because the world it depends on never stays the same. And as that understanding begins to take hold, the story shifts once more, moving from what once was to what continues, connecting these patterns to the world that exists now, where the same forces are still quietly at work. The past is often imagined as something distant, a place removed from the present, existing somewhere far behind the world as it is now. The swamps of the giants, the slow rise and quiet fall of entire ecosystems, can feel like separate stories, disconnected from the lives that continue today. But that distance is not as complete as it seems. The same forces that shaped those ancient worlds are still at work. They have not disappeared. They have not been replaced. They continue quietly, influencing the present in ways that are not always obvious, but are always real. Climate shifts, environmental balance, the relationship between life and the conditions that sustain it. These patterns did not end with the giants. They continue, shaping everything that exists now. The difference is perspective. In the past, change unfolded over spans of time that no single creature could perceive. Entire eras rose and faded without awareness from those living within them. Today, the scale may feel smaller, the changes more immediate, but the process remains the same. The world adjusts and life responds. This is where the connection begins to take form. The story of the amphibian giants is not only about what once existed, it is about how life interacts with the environment that surrounds it. It shows how closely survival is tied to conditions that are never fixed, how even the most dominant forms depend on a balance that can shift beyond their control. That same relationship exists now. Modern ecosystems are shaped by the same principles. Temperature, moisture, availability of resources, stability of environments. These factors continue to determine what thrives and what struggles. The forms have changed, the landscapes have evolved, but the underlying structure remains. Life does not escape these patterns, it moves within them. There is something quietly revealing in this continuity. The idea that the past is not simply a record of what has been lost, but a guide to understanding what continues. The rise and fall of earlier forms of life provide insight into the present, not by predicting exact outcomes, but by revealing how change unfolds and how life responds to it. The giants did not disappear because they failed in some simple way. They disappeared because the world changed beyond what they could follow. That same principle applies to every form of life, including those that exist now. The conditions that support survival are not guaranteed. They are temporary, shaped by processes that continue to move, whether noticed or not. This realization does not create urgency. It creates awareness. The present world, like the past, exists within a balance that is always shifting. The systems that seem stable are part of a larger movement, one that's repeated across time and will continue to do so. Understanding this does not require looking forward into uncertainty. It requires looking back, recognizing the patterns that have already played out. There is a quiet guidance in that recognition. The past does not dictate the future, but it reveals the structure within which the future will unfold. It shows how life adapts, how environments shape what can exist, and how change, even when gradual, carries consequences that extend far beyond a single moment. And within that understanding, the distance between past and present begins to fade. The ancient world is no longer something separate. It becomes part of the same story. The same processes that once shaped the swamps of the giants now shape forests, oceans, and climates across the modern world. The forms are different, but the forces remain. Life continues to respond, to adapt, to exist within conditions that are never entirely stable. There is something grounding in this continuity. The idea that the world has always been changing, that life has always been adapting, and that what exists now is part of a process that extends far beyond any single era. It does not diminish the present. It places it within a larger context, one that offers perspective rather than certainty. And as that perspective settles, as the connection between past and present becomes clearer, the story moves towards something even broader. Because these patterns do not stop at understanding the present, they continue forward, shaping what comes next within a story that has no fixed ending, only a constant unfolding that connects every moment to the ones before and after it. The story does not end where one chapter fades. It continues, not in the same form, not with the same creatures, but with the same quiet movement that has always guided life forward. The amphibian giants are no longer present in the world as it exists now. Their vast bodies and silent dominance replaced by forms better suited to the conditions that followed. Yet their absence does not mark a conclusion. It becomes part of something larger, something that has never truly stopped. The Earth does not reach an ending. It changes, across vast stretches of time. The planet continues to shift in ways that are often too slow to notice, yet powerful enough to reshape everything. Continents move, climates transform, ecosystems rise and fall, and life responds with the same steady persistence it has always shown. What once seemed permanent dissolves into something new, and what emerges carries forward the story without interruption. The giants are part of that story. They existed within a moment that felt complete while it lasted, shaping their world as completely as any dominant form can. But that moment passed, not because it was insignificant, but because the process that created it continued. The same forces that allowed their rise carried the world beyond them, opening space for new forms, new systems, and new expressions of life. Nothing is held in place forever. Not the land, not the climate, not the creatures that define an era. Everything moves, not with urgency, but with inevitability, following patterns that extend far beyond any single point in time. The rise and fall of species, the shifting of ecosystems, the transformation of the planet itself. These are not separate events. They are part of a continuous unfolding. There is something deeply quiet in this realization. The understanding that life is not moving toward a final state, not building toward a fixed outcome. It is moving through stages, each one connected to the last, each one giving way to what follows. The boundaries between beginnings and endings begin to blur, revealing transitions rather than conclusions. The world that exists now is not separate from the one that came before. It is built upon it. Every forest, every river, every landscape carries within it traces of earlier worlds, layers of change that have shaped what can exist today. The forms of life that move through these environments may appear entirely new, yet they are connected to a history that extends back through countless transformations. The present is not isolated. It is part of the same story. And within that story, the sense of time begins to shift. The past is no longer something that has been left behind. It becomes something that continues, influencing what exists now in ways that are not always visible, but always present. There is no single point where the story stops, only moments where it changes direction. The amphibian giants had their time, as others will have theirs. Each era feels complete while it unfolds, yet each is only a part of something that continues beyond it. The world does not pause to mark these transitions. It carries them forward, quietly, without interruption. And now, in the present, the same process continues. The landscapes that exist today, the creatures that move within them, the systems that appear stable, all of it is part of a moment that will one day shift into something else. Not suddenly, not all at once, but gradually, in the same way it always has. There is a quiet wonder in that continuity. The idea that the story has no true ending, only a constant unfolding that connects every form of life, every environment, every moment across time. What existed before has shaped what exists now, and what exists now will shape what comes next. And within that unfolding, there is a final realization that settles gently, without urgency, but with clarity. This story is not something distant. It is not something that has already happened and been left behind. It is still happening. And everything that exists today is part of it, moving forward within the same patterns that have always guided life, shaping a future that has already begun to form within the present moment. The world does not forget as easily as it seems. What disappears from sight does not always vanish completely. Beneath the surface, beyond the reach of movement and time as it is experienced above, something remains, not in the form of living presence, not as sound or motion, but as stillness, preserved, layered, and quietly held within the earth itself. When the giants faded from their world, they did not leave behind monuments or visible traces that could be seen in the landscapes that followed. Their absence settled into silence, the waters shifted, the land changed, and life continued without them. But beneath that continuing surface, something else began to take shape, a different kind of memory. Bodies that once moved through dark swamps came to rest within soft ground. Slowly, almost gently, they sank into mud and sediment, their forms settling into a place where movement no longer reached. There was no intention in this process, no design behind it. It unfolded naturally, guided by gravity, by water, by the quiet accumulation of material over time. Layer upon layer began to form. Sediment gathered, covering what had fallen still, pressing down with a steady weight that did not rush or pause. The soft remains of once living forms were gradually surrounded, then enclosed, held within the earth in a way that protected them from the forces that would otherwise erase them completely. Time passed, not in moments, but in spans too vast to measure in any familiar way. The layers above grew thicker, the pressure increased, and the materials within began to change. What was once organic slowly transformed, its structure replaced, its shape preserved in a form that no longer lived but did not disappear. This is how fossils begin, not as objects created to be found, but as consequences of stillness. The earth does not record life with intention. It does not choose what to preserve or what to let fade. And yet through this quiet process, fragments of the past are held in place, protected beneath layers that continue to build above them. The giants, though gone from the surface, remain here. Their bones, their shapes, their presence captured not as living beings, but as impressions that endure long after movement has ceased. They are no longer part of the active world, but they are not entirely lost. They exist as traces. There is something almost unsettling in this kind of preservation. The idea that a world can disappear so completely from the surface, yet remain hidden beneath it, waiting without awareness, without change, for something that may or may not ever come. The earth becomes an archive, but not one that organizes or explains itself. It holds its layers. It keeps every life that has existed leaves behind something, even if it is small, even if it is incomplete. Not all are preserved, not all remain in forms that can be recognized, but enough endure to create a record, a fragmented, scattered memory of what once was. This is the quiet reveal. Nothing that lives disappears without a trace. The surface may change, the living world may move on, but beneath it, the past settles into place, becoming part of a deeper structure that holds the history of life in ways that are not immediately visible. The fossils of the giants are part of that structure. They lie beneath layers of rock, hidden within the earth, untouched by the world that has replaced them. They do not speak, they do not move, and yet they carry within them the shape of something that once defined entire ecosystems. They are not stories that have been told. They are stories that remain waiting. Waiting beneath pressure and time, beneath landscapes that no longer resemble the world they came from. Waiting without awareness, without urgency, held in place by processes that do not stop, do not reverse, do not reveal themselves easily. And somewhere within those layers, in darkness that has lasted longer than any living memory, the forms of ancient life remain intact enough to be recognized, preserved in silence until something from the present begins to reach down, slowly uncovering what has been held for so long because the earth has not only kept these traces, it has hidden them. And in that hiddenness, the next part of the story begins, not with the past itself, but with those who will one day begin to search for it. The earth may preserve the past, but it does not explain it. What lies beneath the surface is silent, fragmented, and incomplete. Bones remain, impressions endure. Shapes are held within stone, yet none of them arrive with context or clarity. They do not tell their story directly. They wait to be interpreted, to be uncovered, to be understood through careful attention and patient effort. The process begins slowly. A fragment emerges from the ground, often unnoticed at first, its surface worn by time, its edges softened by the long pressure of sediment. It does not reveal everything at once. It offers only a piece, a small part of something larger that no longer exists in full. And from that single piece, a question begins to form. What was this? Excavation follows, not with force but with precision. The surrounding material is removed carefully, layer by layer, as if disturbing the past too quickly might erase what little remains. Each movement is deliberate, each discovery adding to a picture that is still incomplete. More fragments appear. A section of bone, a curved structure, a pattern that suggests form, but does not yet confirm it. These pieces are gathered, studied, compared not only with each other, but with what has been found before. The process is not one of certainty. It is one of connection, of trying to understand how these fragments once fit together within a living body. Gradually, a shape begins to emerge. Not perfectly, not completely, but enough to suggest something that once moved, once existed in a world that can no longer be seen. The skeleton is reconstructed, not as it was found, but as it might have been. Missing pieces are inferred, Gaps are filled with careful reasoning, and what was once scattered becomes something that resembles life again. But it is never exact. There is always uncertainty within this process, a quiet awareness that what is being created is not the past itself, but an interpretation of it. The bones provide structure, but they do not reveal everything. They do not show movement, behavior, or the full presence of the creature as it once was. Imagination becomes part of the reconstruction, not in a way that invents, but in a way that bridges what is missing. The environment is considered, the position of the bones examined, the relationships between different forms studied. From these details, a world begins to take shape, one that feels real yet remains just beyond complete understanding. This is where the deeper realization begins to settle. The past is never fully recovered, it is approached. Each discovery adds clarity, but also reveals how much remains unknown. Each reconstruction brings the ancient world closer, but never completely into reach. There are always gaps, always questions that cannot be answered with certainty, always details that remain hidden beneath layers that have not yet been uncovered. What we understand is only a portion, a glimpse, and that glimpse changes over time. As new discoveries are made, earlier interpretations shift. Structures are re-examined, conclusions are revised, and what once seemed certain becomes part of an ongoing process of understanding. Knowledge does not remain fixed. It evolves just as the world it seeks to explain once did. There is something humbling in this. The recognition that even with careful study, even with attention and time, the past cannot be fully reconstructed in the way it once existed. It can be approached, understood in fragments, but never completely restored. The amphibian giants, though partially revealed through these efforts, remain partly unknown. Their full story is not written in a single discovery or a single reconstruction. It is built gradually through pieces gathered across time, each one adding to a picture that is always incomplete. And yet, that incompleteness does not diminish the story. It deepens it, because it leaves room for discovery, for the possibility that something more remains hidden, waiting to be found. The past is not a finished narrative. It is something that continues to unfold, shaped by each new understanding, each new fragment brought into the light. And as that understanding grows, as the outlines of this lost world become clearer while never fully complete, the story begins to extend beyond what has been discovered. Because these fragments do more than reveal the past. They shape how the present is understood. And in that connection, the story continues, moving from what has been uncovered toward what it means for the life that exists now. Still shaped by a history that is only partially known, the fragments of the past do more than reveal what once existed. They invite a different kind of understanding. Bones preserved in stone, shapes reconstructed from scattered pieces, traces of life held beneath layers of time. These are not only records, they are windows, opening onto something far larger than any single creature or moment. Through them, the scale of time begins to expand beyond what is easily imagined. Deep time does not move in ways that feel familiar. It stretches across spans so vast that entire worlds can rise, flourish, and disappear without leaving a clear mark on the surface that follows. The amphibian giants lived within one of those worlds. Their presence once defined entire ecosystems, shaping environments in ways that seemed complete while they lasted. Yet that completeness did not protect them from change. Their world shifted. And in that shift, everything they were became part of something that no longer exists in the same form. This is where meaning begins to take shape, not in the details of what they looked like or how they moved, but in what their story reveals about the nature of existence itself. The rise of the giants, their dominance, and their eventual fading are not isolated events. They are expressions of a process that continues across time, shaping life in ways that extend far beyond any single era. Deep time reveals this process clearly. It shows that change is not an interruption, but a constant. That stability is temporary, even when it feels complete. That every form of life exists within conditions that will eventually shift beyond it, no matter how well it fits within them in the present. There is something both distant and immediate in this realization. The events themselves belong to a past that cannot be returned to, yet the pattern they follow continues to operate now. The same forces that shape the world of the giants continue to shape the world that exists today, guiding the movement of life in ways that are not always visible, but always present. This creates a connection that is difficult to ignore. The past is not separate from the present. It is part of the same unfolding. The story of the giants becomes more than a description of what has been lost. It becomes a reflection of how life exists within time, how it rises within certain conditions, and fades as those conditions change. It reveals that no form, no matter how dominant, exists outside of this process. There is no fixed point, no final state, only movement. This understanding does not diminish the significance of what has come before. It gives it depth. It shows that each era, each form of life, contributes to a larger continuity, one that cannot be fully understood by looking at a single moment in isolation. The scale of this continuity is almost difficult to hold in mind. Millions of years pass, and within that time, entire systems form and dissolve. Landscapes transform, climates shift, and life adapts again and again, following patterns that repeat without ever being exactly the same. The giants were part of that pattern. So are the forms that exist now, and so will be whatever comes next. There is a quiet sense of wonder in this perspective. The recognition that the present moment, which feels so immediate and complete, is part of a timeline that extends far beyond it. That the world as it exists now is only one version among many that have come before, and many that will follow. This does not create distance. It creates place. The viewer is no longer separate from the story. They are part of it, existing within the same flow of time that carried the giants into existence, and then beyond it. The scale may be vast, the changes may be slow, but the connection remains. And in that connection, the meaning of the past becomes clearer. It is not only about what happened, it is about what continues. Because the story of life is not contained within any single era, any single form, or any single moment. It extends across time, shaping and reshaping itself, carrying forward patterns that reveal something fundamental about existence. That everything changes. And that within that change, something always continues, linking the distant past to the present in ways that are both subtle and profound, forming a story that has no true beginning and no final end. Only an endless unfolding that continues to shape the world and everything within it. The world that exists today feels stable. Forests rise where they have stood for generations. Rivers follow paths that seem permanent, and the movement of life appears steady, almost predictable. It is easy to believe that what surrounds us now is fixed, that the balance we observe is something established and lasting. Yet beneath that sense of stability, the same processes that shape the distant past continue, quietly altering the world in ways that are not always seen. Change has never stopped. It moves slowly, often beyond the scale of human attention, unfolding across time in ways that feel almost invisible. The land shifts in subtle ways, climates adjust over long stretches, and ecosystems respond with small variations that accumulate into something larger. These changes do not announce themselves. They do not disrupt everything at once. They build layer by layer, just as they always have. The forests that stand today are not the same as those that existed before them. They grow from soil shaped by ancient life, from cycles of growth and decay that extend back through countless transformations. The composition of the air, the movement of water, the structure of the land, all of it carries the imprint of what has come before. The present world is not separate from the past. It is built upon it, shaped by processes that have been unfolding for far longer than any single moment can contain. This is where the connection becomes clear. The amphibian giants no longer move through swamps or rest beneath still waters, but the conditions that once allowed their existence continue to influence the world. The balance between moisture and dryness, the relationship between temperature and life, the constant interaction between organisms and their environment. These are not new patterns. They are continuations of processes that have always been present. The past does not remain behind. It remains within. Every landscape holds layers of history that are not immediately visible, but still active. The ground beneath a forest may contain traces of environments that no longer exist. The climate that supports life today has been shaped by countless shifts that occurred long before the present. Even the forms of life that now dominate the world carry within them adaptations that were shaped through earlier stages of evolution. There is no clear boundary between what was and what is. The distinction exists only in perspective. From within the present, it is easy to see the past as something distant, something that has already happened and no longer affects what exists now. But when viewed through the patterns that connect these moments, that separation begins to fade. The processes that shaped ancient worlds continue to operate, guiding the movement of life in ways that are consistent, even as the details change. This creates a quiet realization. The world that exists today is not final. It is part of an ongoing transformation. The stability that seems so certain is only temporary, held in place by conditions that will continue to shift. Just as the world of the giants changed beyond recognition, so too will the present world evolve into forms that cannot yet be fully imagined. This does not happen suddenly. It unfolds gradually through small changes that build over time. A shift in temperature alters the balance of an ecosystem. A change in moisture reshapes the distribution of life. New forms emerge, others fade, and the system adjusts, continuing forward without pause. The same rhythm persists: growth, change, adaptation. These patterns have never stopped, and they are not limited to the distant past. They are active now, shaping the world in ways that are often unnoticed until their effects become clear. There is something grounding in this continuity. The idea that the present is not isolated, not separate from what has come before, but connected through processes that extend across time. The story of life does not begin in one moment and end in another. It flows, carrying each era into the next, shaping the world as it moves forward. And within that flow, the sense of permanence begins to shift. What seems fixed reveals itself as temporary. What feels complete becomes part of something ongoing. The world continues to change, even when it appears still, guided by the same forces that once shaped ancient landscapes and will continue to shape what comes next. Because the story has never stopped, it has only moved forward. And as that movement continues, quietly and without interruption, the present becomes not an ending, but a moment within a much larger process, one that extends beyond what can be seen, carrying the past into the future in ways that are always unfolding, always shaping what the world will become next. The future often feels uncertain. It stretches forward without clear shape, filled with possibilities that are difficult to define. From within the present, it appears open, unpredictable, influenced by countless factors that seem too complex to fully understand. Yet when the patterns of the past are considered, that uncertainty begins to take on a different form. Not clarity, but structure. The same processes that shaped ancient worlds have not disappeared. They continue, quietly active, guiding the movement of life in ways that are not always obvious, but remain consistent over time. The rise of the amphibian giants, their dominance, and their eventual fading were not isolated events. They were expressions of forces that still operate, shaping the world as it exists now. Climate shifts, environments change, ecosystems adjust. These are not new developments. They are part of a continuous pattern that has unfolded across millions of years. The difference is not in the process itself, but in the moment in which it is observed. What once occurred beyond awareness can now be recognized, not as something separate, but as part of the same ongoing system. This is where the future begins to connect with the past. The patterns that once led to the rise and fall of entire forms of life remain present. Conditions change, sometimes slowly, sometimes in ways that are difficult to predict. As those conditions shift, the balance of life responds. Some forms adapt, others struggle, and new possibilities begin to emerge. The outcome is never identical, but the structure is familiar. Life does not move randomly. It responds to the environment in ways that follow certain principles. When conditions favor stability, systems grow more complex and interconnected. When conditions shift, that complexity is tested, reshaped, or reduced. The process continues, not as a repetition of exact events, but as a continuation of the same underlying rhythm. This creates a subtle tension, not a sense of immediate change, but an awareness that the present is part of something that does not remain fixed. The world that exists now, like the world of the giants, is shaped by conditions that will continue to evolve. The balance that supports life today is not permanent. It is part of a system that moves forward, whether noticed or not. There is no need for certainty to understand this. The future does not reveal itself in precise outcomes or defined events. It reveals itself in patterns. The same forces that once shaped ancient ecosystems continue to shape modern ones. The same relationships between life and environment remain active, guiding what can exist and what cannot. The forms will be different. The details will change. But the process will continue. This realization does not create fear or urgency. It creates awareness, the understanding that the present moment is part of a larger movement, one that extends beyond immediate perception. The patterns that have already unfolded offer insight, not into exact predictions, but into the nature of change itself. And within that understanding, the future becomes less distant. It is not something separate from the present. It is already forming within it. The conditions that exist now are shaping what will come next, just as past conditions shaped what exists now. The process is continuous, unfolding step by step, guided by forces that have always been present. This leads to a quiet question. Not one that demands an answer, but one that invites reflection. If the same patterns continue, if the same forces remain active, then what forms are beginning to emerge within the present that will define the future in ways that cannot yet be fully seen? Because the future is not waiting, it is already in motion. And within that motion, the same rhythms that shaped the past continue to unfold, carrying the story forward into a chapter that is not yet written, but already taking shape within the world as it exists. Now, the story does not arrive at an ending. It settles into a moment, pauses just long enough to be observed, and then continues beyond it, carrying everything that has come before into what follows. The rise of the amphibian giants, their quiet dominance, their gradual fading, and the emergence of new life are not separate events placed neatly along a timeline. They are connected movements within a sequence that never truly stops. Each chapter feels complete while it unfolds. The giants once defined their world so fully that it would have been difficult to imagine anything replacing them. The landscapes they shaped, the systems they supported, the balance they created all appeared stable, as though they belonged to something lasting. And yet, that moment passed not suddenly, not violently, but through a process that transformed it into something else. What followed did not erase what came before. It carried it forward. The reptiles that rose into new environments did so within a world already shaped by earlier forms of life. The ecosystems that formed after the giants did not begin from nothing. They emerged from what remained, from the structures and conditions that had been built over time. Each new chapter grows from the last, even as it changes direction. This is the nature of the story. It does not reset, it evolves. The earth continues to move through time with quiet persistence, reshaping itself in ways that are often too gradual to notice. Forests rise and fall, climates shift, and life adapts to conditions that are always changing. What exists in one moment becomes the foundation for the next, creating a continuity that extends beyond any single era. There is no final state waiting to be reached, no moment where the story becomes complete. Instead, there is only transition. The forms of life that exist now are part of the same process that once shaped the giants. They live within conditions that will continue to change, just as they always have. What feels stable today will one day become part of the past, not as something lost, but as something that contributed to what follows. This continuity creates a different way of seeing the world. The past is no longer distant. It is present within everything that exists now, woven into the structure of the land, the patterns of ecosystems, and the forms of life that continue to adapt. The future is not separate either. It is forming within the same processes, shaped by the conditions that are already in motion. All of it is connected. There is something quietly profound in this realization. The idea that the story of life is not a series of beginnings and endings, but a continuous unfolding that carries each moment into the next. That nothing exists in isolation, and nothing truly stands still. Everything moves guided by patterns that extend across time, linking the ancient world to the present, and the present to what has yet to come. The amphibian giants are part of that movement. They are not only a memory of what once was, but a chapter that continues to influence the story as it unfolds. Their rise and fall are not separate from the world that exists now. They are part of the same sequence, shaping the conditions that made everything else possible. And now, in this moment, the story continues. The modern world, with its forests, rivers, and living systems, carries within it the same quiet processes that shaped ancient swamps. The connection is not always visible, but it is always present, linking distant time to the present in ways that are subtle but unbroken. There is no final conclusion waiting at the end of this story, only continuation. And within that continuation, a final understanding settles gently, without urgency, but with clarity that remains. This is not a story that has already been told. It is one that is still unfolding. And everything that exists now is part of it, moving forward within the same patterns that have always guided life, shaping a future that will one day become another chapter in a story that never truly ends.